Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. It's Global Exchange and Co-op America who have built this great annual event. And as you go through the various booths and exhibits, consider what it all means when it's put together. It really means a lot more than the analysis of it, but we certainly know it means the emergence of a green sub-economy, which is very important. It certainly means more education about the quality of economic systems, not just how big the GDP is, how do the fruits of economic output benefit people who are now excluded, the distribution issue, not just the aggregate economic growth, but how is it distributed? And I think that we can see in many ways enough models of superior performance that meet environmental, sustainability, health, safety, access to justice, entrepreneurialism in its best sense. There are enough models of superior performance that we can now point to, so we're not just dealing with theory, we're dealing with people who've actually done it on the ground, whether it's profitable organic farming, whether it's cooperatives, whether it's new kinds of grassroots media, whether it's a redefinition of what food should be all about, and of course the many environmental facets of an economic system. This afternoon I would really want to push the envelope, and I hope you'll carry it forward. We do need a more fundamental strategy here on giant corporate power. That is the central political issue of our time. It's corporate power and the takeover of our government and the spread of commercial values into every nook and cranny of our culture, including the commercialization of childhood, the commercialization of universities, the commercialization of almost everything these large companies touch. First, we have to make a distinction between giant multinational corporations who have subverted even capitalist principles by refusing to give their owners, which include labor pension fund stockholders, any kind of authority or role under a principle of capitalism. If you own something, you're supposed to have some control over it, not with corporate capitalism. They also subvert a principle of capitalism, which if you can't make it in the market, you go down. Instead, they go to Washington for a bailout, handout, giveaway, loan guarantee, like nuclear power is at the present time. And so don't ever let them get away with this association with capitalists. The only capitalists in this country are small business. They're the only ones who are free to go bankrupt and aren't able to go to Washington for a bailout. The giant corporations are a new animal with long antecedents. They transcend national boundaries. They can circumvent the laws, the regulations, the processes of nations, states, and localities. Think of them as giants astride the globe, able to avoid the rule of law, able to avoid accountability, able to avoid the monitoring of elected officials, able to avoid the courts, as they pit one country against another with a propulsion downward on standards of living in more developed countries toward the poverty of the undeveloped countries. We have to keep up with the dynamic lethality and greed and destructiveness of giant corporations that are out of control. They are very dynamic. If you just look at all the financing instruments they're developing, whether it's home mortgages or whether it's mergers and acquisitions, You don't know anymore who owns what. They have so many tiers of companies. The other day, there was a report that says tort lawyers are having trouble suing nursing home chains for severe mistreatment of elderly people and neglect. And the reason why is because these nursing home chains are owned by tiers of corporations, some of them offshore, and the most immediate tier have very few assets. So they can't be responsible for paying the verdicts. And so the tort lawyers say, well, we just can't handle it. And so more and more people can be mistreated or neglected in these nursing homes with impunity. So let me start with a sequence here and see how it courts your favor in terms of engagement. Let's start with a plus here. In the year 2000, Business Week magazine, which is the corporate magazine, biggest circulation, had a headline that said, "Too much corporate power" on the cover. And inside, it had 6 detailed pages saying yes, yes, yes. It then polled the public and registered 72% of the American people thought corporations had too much control over their lives. It then had an editorial with a ringing phrase that said, quote, "Corporations should get out of politics," end quote. I would assume the assumption is they are not human beings. Only human beings should have constitutional rights, not corporations. Now, I hope you get that copy, because it's always good to cite Business Week. It's always good to cite the enormous coverage that the business press has given to the corporate crime wave, which since the year 2000, when Business Week cover came out, has looted or drained trillions of dollars from worker pensions, produced the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs, and shredded huge amounts of investor assets, small investor assets. You can imagine what that poll would register today if it registered 72% before Enron, WorldCom, Adelphia, HealthSouth, and the Wall Street crooks. So it isn't that we have an uphill battle with public opinion, right? And it's important to start with that. But it's also important to recognize that every day the imbalance of power between giant corporations and what could be a countervailing government, what could be a countervailing trade union movement, what could be a countervailing consumer and environmental movement, what could be a countervailing animation of elections and political parties, all these are getting weaker, year by year, month by month. I won't burden you with the data because you probably know it, but it is overwhelming. In Washington, D.C., every department and agency in the U.S. government, when you ask what is the most overwhelming, powerful external force on this agency or department, whether it's the Treasury Department, Agriculture Department, Department of Defense, Food and Drug Administration, etc., the answer is the same: corporate power. That includes the Labor Department. Corporate power. That's one way to measure it. Another way to measure it is the convergence of the two major parties on fundamental issues of corporate power, corporate crime, corporate welfare, and corporate takeover of our elections. There are 35,000 full-time corporate lobbyists in this city, and they don't spend their time looking at the Washington Monument. There are 10,000 political action committees that corporate funds funnel money into members of Congress and the White House, political coffers. The drug company alone, the drug industry alone, has 500 full-time lobbyists on Capitol Hill. That's how they got the hundreds of billions of dollars of what's called the drug benefit bill. Only it benefited the drug companies more than the patients or the taxpayers who are footing the bill. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had a nuanced use of language, unlike the present occupant in the White House, transferred a request in 1938 to the Congress urging the establishment of an organization that would analyze and investigate corporate power. And the Congress obliged. That's the Temporary National Economic Commission, TNEC. In his message, he said the following: when government is controlled by private economic power, that is fascism. When government is controlled by private economic power, that is fascism. He may be the most prominent person who made that description, but he clearly wasn't the only one. What that means is that when you hear people say, oh, the government isn't doing this or doing that, please apply an adjective. It's the corporate government that isn't doing this or doing that. It's the corporate government that leaves tens of millions of impoverished people, many of them minorities, in our cities and rural areas, subject to the rapacious corporate crime of predatory lending, of rent-to-own rackets, of enormous interest rates for payday loans, of housing code violations that jeopardize health and safety, of lead and asbestos, and heavy forms of contamination that have been called environmental racism. Outside the rule of law, outside law and order, outside enforcement. That's the corporate government. The sheriff is not coming to town when it comes to corporate crime. So let's not talk about things like privatization when we know the word is corporatization. Let's not talk about things like the private sector when we know the phrase is the corporate sector. And when we talk about welfare, let's talk about the biggest monetary pile of welfare every day coming out of taxpayer monies called corporate welfare, to the largest, most profitable corporations in the world. General Electric is on corporate welfare. Intel is on corporate welfare. Cisco is on corporate welfare. Microsoft is on corporate welfare. Pfizer is on corporate welfare. Merck is on corporate welfare. Tell me one large company that isn't on corporate welfare. Half of this city is shoveling out hundreds and hundreds of programs of subsidies, handouts, giveaways, tax escapes, etc. The nuclear industry wants to build more nuclear plants. They can't meet the market test. So they got the Senate, with the Democrats in charge a few weeks ago, to pass a $50 billion loan guarantee provision, mostly for new nuclear plants. It's corporate welfare. It's important to note also that the struggle throughout history has been one of commercial values against civic values, the values of profiteering, the values of single-minded aggregation of profits no matter what the cost, against the values of justice, tolerance, health, safety, regard for posterity, access to justice, the freedom of the many to participate in power. Marcus Cicero's great definition of freedom. Freedom is participation in power. That's the definition we got to take to every city hall, every state house, every corporate shareholder meeting, every congressional hearing. If there isn't a shift of power to the people from the corporations, none of all these great things that we know can be done for our country and our world, many of them exhibited here this weekend, can be significantly and quantitatively successful. They will just be models. Every politician running for office at whatever level should be asked the cardinal question: what are you recommending and what have you done to shift power from the few who now decide for the many to the many who will decide for the few? And we know ways to do that. We know ways to do that. We open up access to justice. We expand the tort system so wrongfully injured people in the workplace, in the market, in the environment can take their perpetrators, their wrongful, injurious perpetrators to court before judge and jury. And that access is being closed out by corporate power. It's grotesquely called tort reform. Shutting the corporate doors to the most defenseless people, brain-damaged infants from medical malpractice, people suffering from cancer because of occupational workplace disease. It's not a small matter. 58,000 Americans die every year from work-related diseases and trauma. 100,000 die every year from medical malpractice in hospitals alone, sometimes euphemistically called medical errors. 65,000 Americans die every year from air pollution. These are OSHA figures, EPA figures, Harvard School Public Health figures. You ever see anybody make a big issue out of any of these? What are they waiting for? Some terrorist gang in Afghanistan saying they're going to increase occupational disease in the United States or medical malpractice? Maybe that'll wake them up, huh? What are these styles of violence where the greatest sources of preventable violence in our country are rampantly and grotesquely ignored while we spend hundreds of billions of dollars overseas? So much of it producing more violence and more waste and more corruption. Anybody who controls the yardsticks by which a society is measured will control the agenda. We have to develop new yardsticks. When Alan Greenspan was chairman of the Federal Reserve, he'd go up to Congress and give his State of the Economy testimony. And it usually would be something like, Mr. Chairman and members of the Joint Economic Committee, the state of the economy is in general quite good. And then he talks about profits, gross national product, inventory levels, capital accumulation. What if there were other yardsticks he had to measure up on Capitol Hill? What if he had to say, as he should have said if he's reflecting reality, Mr. Chairman, the state of our economy is not good for 80% of the American people. 80 million people live in poverty, contrary to the absurd definition of poverty by the Labor Department, which defines poverty as a family of four making under $19,000 a year. By other definitions, 80 million easily come under the definition of poverty. 13 million children go to bed hungry every night in the land of the free, home of the brave. 50 million people make under $10.50 an hour, $6, $7, $8, $9 Walmart wages. 45 to 48 million people do not have any health insurance. 18,000 people in this country die because they can't afford health care. When they talk about waits in England for health care, tell them about waits that are so long that 18,000 people, 6 9/11s, die in this country because they can't afford health care. Those figures are conservative. They come from the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Science. They don't even count the diseases and the injuries that occur and are worsened and are not diagnosed because people can't afford health care. We have to have our own yardsticks. We have to have our own people's economic yardsticks by which to measure our economy. Do not use the corporate yardsticks to measure the economy. They won't talk about the distribution of the gains that were produced by the sweat of millions and millions of American workers who are making less and less in terms of the return on labor compared to the return on capital. And that's been going on for over 25 years. Yardsticks, the quality of the economy. They can control public opinion by simply saying, oh, look at the GDP. It went up 4% this quarter over last year. Oh, look at profits. They're up 10%. And that's what goes over the evening news. We have to turn that around and expose the fraud of these yardsticks, which are oligarchic, plutarchic large yardsticks. They're not people yardsticks. Remember, whoever controls the yardsticks, whether it's the SAT or the graduate record exams or the definition of beauty or the definition of political success, will control the agenda, will control the way we look at the world. In analyzing who we should pay attention to, it helps to ask one single question. If millions of people do not have health care, who is saying no to their getting health care? The HMOs, the drug companies, the hospital chains. If tens of millions of people don't have a living wage, who's saying no to a living wage? The Walmarts, the Kmarts, the McDonald's, the Burger Kings. If tens of millions of people are having to pay more taxes than they should, and the rich and powerful and corporate are paying far less than they should, who's saying no to this kind of tax reform? It's these corporations and their executives. If you make capital gains and dividends, you pay 15%. If you work in a steel mill, you're up to 33%. Quite a difference between the maximum tax rate for clipping coupons in a Park Avenue condo and going to a hot steel mill every day, 5 days a week. The tax rate is over double on workers. Who is saying no to cleaning up the election process, which is now on an auction for the highest bidder? They have quarterly returns now for Hillary and Obama and Edward, like they're corporations. It's corporate money that's saying no. Who's saying no to access to courts for people who desperately need compensatory justice? It's the corporate wrongdoers. After a while, you get the idea, huh? Where the focus is. I usually don't like this phraseology, but I find it irresistible. Whenever